In the depths of Colorado's Rocky Mountains, where snow blankets the land and the cold can be deadly, survival demands both courage and boldness. With that in mind, let us journey back to the year 1873, when these mountains became the stage for a grim case that continues to spark controversy. A man named Alfred Packer found himself at the center of a horrifying tale of cannibalism. Some believed he murdered and cannibalized 5 men during an expedition driven by greed. Others argue that he consumed human flesh only to survive the harsh conditions. Interestingly, in some parts of Colorado, Alfred is regarded as a local hero. From books to old newspapers accounts and official records, there are almost as many versions of this story as there are accounts from Alfred himself. After all, he was the sole witness to what truly happened to the group. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Alcione Posamai, and welcome to another frightening episode of Lost Bones. In this episode, we will dive into this complex tale and the fate of Alfred Packer, who today is remembered as the diabolical cannibal of the mountains. During the harsh winter of November 1873, a group of prospectors from Bingham Canyon in Utah, United States, set out toward the San Juan Mountains in Colorado. These men were mostly strangers to one another, brought together by Bob McCrew, who persuaded them to embark on the journey with promises of newfound riches based on reports of gold discovered in Breckenridge. Among the prospectors was the guide Alfred Packer, a 31-year-old man who would later become the central figure in this story. Along the way, the group lost much of their supplies, particularly food, due to the extreme weather conditions plaguing the region. By January of 1874, just over 2 months after starting the expedition, the men arrived starving and exhausted at a Native American encampment in northwestern Colorado. There, they were welcomed, fed, and cared for by members of the Ute tribe led by Chief Oury, known as the Friend of the White Man. The tribe not only offered their hospitality, but also advised the group against continuing their journey, warning them that the mountains were treacherous due to the heavy and dangerous snowfalls at that time of year. Chief Oury suggested they wait until spring to resume their expedition and even offered to shelter them through the winter, sharing the tribe's resources. However, not all accepted his advice. Driven by their ambition for gold, 11 men decided to push forward. Their plan was to travel first to the Los Pinos Indian Agency, the nearest outpost, and then continue to Breckenridge. Chief Oury provided supplies and instructions for safety navigating around the mountains. Despite this, Alfred Packer insisted that crossing directly through the mountain was a shorter route. The group then split into 2. Shannon Bell, Israel Swan, James Humphrey, Frank Miller, and George Nunn chose to follow Alfred through the mountains, while the others opted for a different path. The small group, led by Alfred, prepared for what they believed would be a journey of 65 kilometers. On February 9th, they set out for the Los Pinos Indian Agency, located near Cochetopa Creek. However, the actual distance was approximately 120 kilometers, nearly twice as far as they had estimated. Due to incorrect information from another small group also planning to continue their journey, the men grossly underestimated the distance they would have to travel. They prepared for a much shorter trip than what lay ahead. That would be the last time the 5 men were seen alive. After all, none of the group truly knew the Colorado territory. The only one who claimed some familiarity with the region was Alfred Packer, who would later prove to be far less reliable than he had presented himself. 2 months later, questions began to arise about the whereabouts of the prospectors. On April 16, 1874, 65 days after their departure, Alfred Packer emerged alone from the wilderness. He crossed the frozen bed of a lake and arrived at Los Pinos Indian Agency, where the men at the outpost were having breakfast. Exhausted, Alfred entered the building, pleading for food and shelter. He carried with him a rifle, a knife, a steel coffee pot, and a backpack. The men seated him at a table and offered him food, but he could not eat without vomiting, claiming his digestion had been impaired by prolonged starvation. Alfred explained that he had been hired by 5 men to guide them to Breckenridge. During the journey, he claimed he was blinded by the snow, fell behind, and became a burden to the group. He recounted that Israel Swan, one of the men, had given him a rifle before the group decided to leave him behind. Since then, Alfred claimed he had survived alone in the mountains with little ammunition and almost no supplies, subsisting on roots, rosebuds, and even parts of his own shoes. Despite his story, the men at the agency found his appearance unusually good for someone who had endured such hardships. Alfred did not appear as emaciated or ragged as other lost wanderers they had encountered before. His face was swollen rather than gaunt, and he curiously drank only whiskey at breakfast, as if he did not truly need proper nourishment after his ordeal. Alfred claimed to be out of money and sold the rifle he was carrying to Major Donner, a justice of the peace at the agency, for $10, which would be worth approximately $300 today. He stayed at the agency for 10 days before heading to the nearby town of Saguache, where he began purchasing supplies for his return home to Pennsylvania. Once in Saguache, Alfred bought a horse for $70 and rented a room at the Dolan Saloon. Larry Dolan, the owner of the Dolan Saloon, claimed that Alfred spent about $100 during his stay and even offered to lend him $300. Additionally, Alfred spent $78 at a store and was seen carrying multiple wallets. He remained in Saguache until Preston Nutter, a member of the original group of prospectors, arrived in the town. 2 other men. Preston found Alfred at the Dolan Saloon and questioned him about the rest of the group. Alfred claimed that the men had left to search for food, leaving him at the camp with a rifle during a storm and never returned. He asserted that he had survived alone in the mountains by eating rosebuds and small animals. However, Preston found Alfred's story inconsistent. He considered it unlikely that the group, unfamiliar with the Colorado wilderness, would abandon their guide in snow-covered mountains. Moreover, Alfred appeared too well-fed for someone who claimed to have endured extreme starvation. Suspicious, Preston accused Alfred of theft, which led to an argument. The two were separated, and Alfred continued his preparations to leave Saguache. Meanwhile, the 5 men who had taken the Guinan River route finally arrived at the Los Pinos Indian Agency. There, they were greeted by the head of the agency, General Charles Adams, who mentioned having met Alfred Packer and heard his version of events. The men immediately dismissed Alfred's story, insisting that their companions would never abandon a member of the group to die. The leader of the group presented evidence that cast doubt on Alfred's account. The rifle Alfred had been carrying, according to the men, belonged to Israel Swan, an elderly member of the group, and a pipe Alfred had left behind belonged to Shannon Bell, another member. Based on this information, General Charles Adams sent an agency officer to Saguache with instructions to bring Alfred back under the pretense of seeking his help to locate the missing man. Reluctantly, but with little choice given the growing suspicion surrounding him, Alfred agreed and returned with the officer to the Los Pinos Indian Agency. There, he was met by General Charles Adams and the 5 men he had not seen since February. General Adams was informed that Alfred had spent hundreds of dollars in Saguashi, purchasing a new horse and saddle, and that he possessed items belonging to the missing men, despite claiming to have no money when he joined the group. Faced with these inconsistencies, the men demanded an explanation. Alfred repeated his original story, expressing concern for the missing men's fate and insisting that the money he used in Saguashi had been a loan. General Charles decided to investigate the truth of Alfred's story by sending an officer to Saguash. The officer returned with accounts from various sources describing Alfred carrying multiple wallets and telling contradictory stories about his journey. Furthermore, no one in town confirmed having left him any money. Faced with these inconsistencies, General Charles convened a council with Alfred and the agency officers. During the meeting, 2 members of the Ute tribe arrived, bringing strips of dried human meat they had found near the agency while hunting. Desperate, Alfred pleaded for mercy, promising a full confession. He declared it would not be the first time people were forced to eat one another when starving. This statement marked the beginning of a series of conflicting accounts Alfred would provide over the next 3 decades. In his first official statement, Alfred claimed the group had left a Wari camp with provisions sufficient for 14 days, but the supplies quickly ran out. Trying to survive on roots, pine resin, rosebuds, and the occasional rabbit, the men began to eye one another uneasily. Alfred recounted that one day, upon returning from gathering firewood, he found the other 4 men surrounding the body of Israel, who had been killed with an axe blown to the head. They were cutting up the body, and Alfred admitted to joining them. During this gruesome act, they discovered thousands of dollars on Israel's person and divided the money among themselves. After consuming the most desirable parts of the body, they continued their journey, with Alfred carrying Israel's rifle. 2 days later, again, without meat and unsuccessful in hunting, Alfred claimed that Shannon, James, and George secretly decided Frank would be the next victim. Frank, described as a stocky man, was killed with an axe blown to the head while collecting firewood. His body was dismembered and consumed, and Israel's money was distributed among the survivors before they resumed their trek toward Los Pinos. The winter was relentless, and the group moved slowly, battling low visibility and biting winds. According to Alfred, James was the next to be sacrificed, followed by George. This left only Shannon and Alfred, who, according to his account, swore not to eat one another. At this point, both men possessed rifles and portions of the thousands of dollars they had found on Israel, believing they could survive on the meager game they might still manage to hunt. Alfred and Shannon reportedly agreed that once they reached safely, they would tell others that the rest of the group had died due to the harsh conditions, and they had been buried with dignity, omitting any mention of cannibalism. Days later, exhausted and surviving on nothing more than a rabbit and a few roots, they camped near a large lake. Sometime later, overwhelmed by despair, Shannon allegedly screamed that he could not endure any longer and attempted to attack Alfred with a rifle. Alfred claimed he managed to dodge the attack and, in self-defense, struck Shannon in the head with an axe. Fearing starvation, Alfred reportedly opened Shannon's body, consumed as much as he could, and packed the rest. He also took the money Shannon had been carrying before continuing his journey. Climbing a hill, Alfred finally spotted the Los Pinos Indian Agency. As for the strips of dried meat found by the Ute tribe members, Alfred explained that he had discarded Shannon's remains near the agency, assuming they would quickly be consumed by wild animals. Reluctantly admitting to this final act, Alfred concluded his story. Initially, his account was interpreted as a dramatic and tragic tale of extreme survival, When they questioned about the truth of his version, Alfred insisted he was not lying. General Charles, still uncertain, called a meeting with the 5 men and the agency officials to determine the next steps. They agreed to form a search party to locate the remains, as the 5 survivors of the original group did not believe Alfred's story. The search party, accompanied by Alfred, set out for the locations he described. After 2 weeks of fruitless searching, the group returned empty-handed. During the journey back, Alfred attempted to attack one of the group members with a knife, but was caught in the act, subdued and detained. This attack shifted General Charles' perspective. Previously inclined to believe Alfred's account, he now considered him dangerous and ordered his transfer to Saguashi. There, Alfred was held by the sheriff in an improvised detention facility for his own safety. While in custody, Alfred recounted his story again, including the events leading to the deaths of the 5 men. However, in this new version, he claimed that the group had encountered a severe snowstorm in the mountains, becoming lost and completely without provisions. They had tried to survive by carrying embers in a steel coffee pot to start fires, and failing to hunt or fish, had resorted to eating their shoes and any vegetation they could find. Alfred claimed that the group had made a pact. If anyone died, their flesh would be used to sustain the survivors. According to him, with this agreement in mind, the men managed to survive about 20 days on the provisions they had brought, and an additional 10 days without any substantial food. It was then that Israel passed away, followed by James 5 days later. As the day wore on and hunger became unbearable, Alfred stated that Shannon killed George in desperation, leaving only himself and Shannon alive. The two allegedly agreed to stay together until the end, but at some point, Shannon could no longer endure the situation and attempted to take Alfred's life. Alfred claimed he acted in self-defense and ended up killing Shannon. He confessed to taking valuable items from all the deceased, justifying it by saying they no longer had any use for them. However, as Alfred's accounts changed and new details emerged, his credibility became increasingly questionable. Those tasked with guarding Alfred began to suspect that he might have lured the group into a trap to kill and rob them. This suspicion raised even more doubts about his true role in the tragic events. While Alfred Packer remained in custody, the search for their protector's bodies continued. In August of 1874, John, an illustrator for Harper's Weekly, discovered the site of an incident in Slumgullion Pass, about 3 kilometers southeast of Lake City, Colorado. He found the bodies of the 5 men in a ravine shaded by pine trees, a location that matched Alfred's description of where only Shannon had been killed, according to his account. As the snow melted over the following 4 months, the scene was fully uncovered. John created a detailed sketch of the discovery and reported it to the local authorities in Lake City. His account, accompanied by illustration, was published in Harper's Weekly in October of 1874. The coroner and the police, along with around 20 volunteers, traveled to the site and found the bodies in various stages of decomposition. They had been left exposed to the elements and the activity of wild animals. Despite this, investigators noted clear signs of extreme violence that contradicted Alfred's version of events. The bodies were found grouped together, not scattered over kilometers as Alfred had claimed. Furthermore, James and George still had large portions of flesh, muscles, and organs intact, suggesting they had not been consumed before Shannon supposedly attempted to kill Alfred as he had reported. The men were found with red cloths wrapped around their feet, likely replacing shoes that had been consumed, and old, moldy blankets lay nearby. A beaten path connected the bodies to a rudimentary shelter that Alfred had used. Inside the shelter, investigators found belongings of the men, which Alfred had claimed to have left behind. Evidence indicated that the deaths occurred before the group supplies were completely depleted, supporting the theory that Alfred had murdered the men to rob them, only to become trapped in the snow himself. He may have survived for months in his makeshift shelter, walking to the bodies to cut pieces of meat as he needed. Preston, one of the original members of the prospecting group, identified the bodies as those of the 5 missing men. Near the bodies, a broken rifle was found, possibly used to bludgeon one or more of the victims. Ultimately, the remains were removed and buried on a cliffside near where they were discovered. The area became known as Dead Man's Gulch, a grim reference to the tragic event. With the discoveries made in Dead Man's Gulch, the search party returned to the improvised prison to confront Alfred Packer. However, upon their arrival, they found the place empty. Alfred had escaped, fueling curiosity and intensifying the investigation into his past in the days, months, and years that followed. It is this part that we will now explore. Although there were several discrepancies regarding the spelling of his name, we will refer to him simply as Alfred Packer. He was born sometime in the 1842 in Pennsylvania, one of the 3 children of James Packer and Esther Greener. In the early 1850s, Alfred's family moved to LaGrange County, Indiana, where his father worked as a carpenter. Sources indicate that Alfred had a troubled relationship with his parents, which led him to move to Minnesota at the age of 18. There, he worked as a shoemaker until the onset of the American Civil War. At 19, Alfred enlisted in the United States Infantry in Minnesota. However, his military career was cut short when he was discovered that he suffered from epilepsy, resulting in an honorable discharge. In June of 1863, Alfred tried again, joining the 8th Iowa Cavalry Regiment. Yet again, epilepsy interfered and he was discharged once more. In the following years, Alfred attempted various ways to improve his circumstances, but he was far from the experienced man he claimed to be. Despite his assertion that he was a guide, authorities would later discover that when Alfred left his hometown to join the Colorado Gold Rush, he had no idea what he was doing. In November of 1873, Bob McGrew assembled a group of men eager to join the gold rush in search of fortune in Colorado. During their journey, they encountered Alfred near the town of Provo. Then, 31 years old, Alfred offered to join the group as both a prospector and a guide, claiming to be familiar with the San Juan territory. He paid $25 to integrate into the group, which accepted his offer out of a need for a guide. From the very beginning of the journey, however, the group members noticed that Alfred had exaggerated his skills. He traveled without a rifle, carrying only a Colt revolver, and was soon described as greedy with rations, lazy, stubborn, and according to one member of the group, a whining fraud. These traits would quickly become a problem on the ill-fated journey that lay ahead. In addition to his struggles as a guide, Alfred Packer often clashed with Frank Miller, another member of the group. His epileptic seizures also made the journey more difficult. There were even rumors that Alfred had spent time in prison in Salt Lake City for allegedly murdering a hunting partner. The group advanced slowly towards Breckenridge, battling the harsh winter which immobilized wagons and horses. On the Spanish Trail, they were forced to contend with heavy snow covering the path, requiring the use of compass. Alfred's inexperience became evident on this stretch, causing the group to lose their way. Provisions quickly ran out, and the men were reduced to eating horse feed, even considering sacrificing their animals before finally reaching Chief's Array camp. The rest of the story, however, we already know. Returning to the present, Alfred Packer's escape made the case even more macabre, with the circumstances of the prospector's death remaining a mystery for years. However, in a twist of fate, in March of 1883, 9 years after his escape, Alfred was recognized by a former companion. Frenchy Cabison, a former member of the original group, had arrived at a bar in Fort Fetterman, Wyoming, when he heard a high-pitched laugh that seemed familiar. Searching for the source of the sound, he found Alfred Packer, who was using the alias John Schwartze and drinking with a group of people. Upon being confronted, Alfred managed to flee the bar. Frenchy immediately reported Alfred to the local sheriff, who successfully captured him. The sheriff contacted General Charles to confirm Alfred's identity. Once confirmed, General Charles accompanied Alfred to Denver, where he gave his second official confession, signed on March 16, 1883. This time, Alfred stated that when they left Chief Oury Camp, the group indeed had very few supplies for the challenges they would face. After 2 or 3 days of travel, a snowstorm forced them to seek shelter in a ravine. Along the way, they discovered that the snow was much deeper than they had anticipated. 10 days into the journey, the group was reportedly surviving solely on rosebud and pine resin. Alfred claimed that some members began showing severe signs of depression and even bouts of madness, particularly in the case of Shannon Bell. According to Alfred, the tragic climax occurred one morning when Shannon Bell sent him to scout the mountain in search of food. For the task, Alfred took a rifle and was gone for most of the day, but all he found was more snow and desolation. Upon his return at dusk, Alfred claimed he saw Shannon near the fire, roasting a piece of meat on the tip of a knife. When questioned, Shannon reportedly responded with a disturbing look that he had cut the meat from Frank Miller's leg. Alarmed, Alfred searched for Frank and found him downstream, his skull crushed. Even more horrified, Alfred said he noticed the bodies of the other 3 men near the fire, which with deep gashes in their foreheads. As he approached, Shannon allegedly rose, wielding the same hatchet that Alfred claimed he had used to kill their companions, and charged at him. Alfred recounted that, in self-defense, he fired the rifle, hitting Shannon in the stomach. Even after being shot, Shannon continued to move, prompting Alfred to leap on him and use the hatchet to kill him. According to Alfred, in the days following Shannon Bell's death, he repeatedly attempted to leave the site, but the snow always blocked his path. Trapped in the improvised camp, Alfred claimed he was forced to survive on the flesh of the deceased, a practice he said lasted for approximately 2 months. When the snow finally began to melt, Alfred cut some pieces of meat from the bodies, packed them, took the money from the pockets of each of his companions, and set off, carrying his rifle for protection. At the end of this account, General Charles asked why Alfred had not shared his version of events 9 years earlier. Alfred replied, "I got excited, wanted to say something, and the story as I told it came to my mind first." He also admitted that during the searches, he had avoided advancing to the area where the bodies were located because he did not want to approach the decomposing and consumed corpses. For years, it was believed that Alfred had received help to escape from the prison where he had been detained. However, he revealed that he had used a pocket knife to unlock the cell. After escaping, he fled to Arkansas, Arizona, and eventually Wyoming, where he was recognized. When asked if this confession was truly accurate, Alfred insisted it was, claiming that his account was sworn and truthful. Nevertheless, the trial that followed promised to uncover hidden truths that really happened along the creek where the bodies were found. On April 8, 1883, Alfred Packer was brought to the Hinsdale County Courthouse in Colorado for the start of his trial. Testimonies during the proceedings revealed intriguing details. The family of Israel Swan testified that he had joined the expedition carrying approximately $6,000 in cash and gold, equivalent to nearly $200,000 today, as well as a valuable Winchester rifle. This raised the possibility that Alfred had been motivated by robbery, especially given Israel's advanced age of 65. The prosecution argued that the other 4 members of the expedition might have been accomplices in Israel's murder and later betrayed by Alfred, or that Alfred had killed them, all to eliminate witnesses. However, no gold was found on Alfred when he was apprehended. While he did have some money, it was a relatively small amount, and his spending at the time was modest, far below the thousands of dollars expected to have been taken. The prosecution maintained that the only logical explanation for Alfred venturing into the mountains with such limited supplies was premeditation, intending to murder and rob the group. Alfred pleaded not guilty, but after 7 days of trial, he was found guilty of the premeditated murder of Israel Swan. Israel's remains showed signs of a struggle, while the other 4 men appeared to have been killed in their sleep. The presiding judge stated his belief that Alfred had killed Israel purely out of greed, dismissing survival or self-defense as justifications. The court's final conclusion was that Alfred had murdered all his companions while they slept. Although convicted only for the murder of Israel Swan, Alfred was held accountable for the deaths of the other men as well. He was sentenced to death by hanging, with his execution scheduled for May 19, 1883. He was taken to a prison to await his sentence. Fortune intervened. 2 years passed and Alfred remained imprisoned, exhausting every legal recourse available to him. In October of 1885, the Colorado Supreme Court overturned his murder conviction. The reason was a legislative error. The court ruled that based on an ex post facto law, Alfred could not be convicted of a state crime because Colorado was not officially a state at the time the murders occurred. Furthermore, it was determined that the crime had occurred on indigenous territory, meaning it should have been tried in a federal court. This revelation left many stunned and fearful that Alfred Packer might entirely escape his sentence. In a new trial, the prosecution charged Alfred not only with the murder of Israel Swan, but also with the deaths of his 4 other companions. He was accused of 5 counts of manslaughter, implying that the killings were not premeditated, but the result of reckless actions. Once again, the jury found him guilty. However, this time, the sentence was less severe. Alfred Packer was sentenced to 40 years in prison, with 80 years for each count of manslaughter. At the time, this was the longest prison sentence ever recorded in the United States history. The case popularized the term emergency cannibalism in the West, suggesting that Alfred's actions were not premeditated, but driven by extreme circumstances brought on by starvation. Many viewed his situation as a reflection of human fragility and the primal instincts that surface when faced with dire conditions. The presiding judge reportedly stated that Alfred had become an example of how nature can expose humanity's most primitive side. Alfred was sent to the state penitentiary. 14 years later, he wrote a lengthy letter to a newspaper, offering yet another version of the events, more detailed, but riddled with contradictions. At the end of the letter, Alfred claimed that he had been treated unjustly and was innocent of all accusations. This letter caught the attention of Polly Pry, a journalist for the Denver Post. Polly was moved by Alfred's account and launched a campaign for his release. She portrayed Alfred as an ordinary man who had served in the military and had tragically been placed in an extreme situation. To Polly, he was a victim of circumstance, unjustly vilified for resorting to cannibalism to survive. Polly's articles shifted public opinion about Alfred. Her campaign led to petitions and appeals to Colorado Governor Charles Thomas to reconsider the case. Despite facing significant resistance, the governor relented. His final official act before leaving office was to grant Alfred Packer parole after 18 years in prison. However, the governor did not fully pardon Alfred and imposed the condition that he could not profit from telling his story. This conditional release marked the beginning of a new chapter in Alfred's life, though the mystery and controversy surrounding the events in the San Juan Mountains were never fully resolved. After being granted parole in 1901, Alfred Packer secured a job as a guard at the Denver Post. Many believe this opportunity was arranged by Polly Pry, the journalist who had championed his case. However, city life did not suit Alfred, and he decided to move to the quiet area of Deer Creek Canyon in Jefferson County. In Deer Creek, Alfred's health began to deteriorate, particularly with liver and stomach issues, likely worsened by his years in prison. He spent his final years telling stories to local children and was described by neighbors as a friendly and harmless old man. In 1906, a forest ranger found Alfred unconscious apparently after he had suffered a minor stroke. The following year, Alfred wrote a letter to the governor of Colorado requesting a full pardon for his crimes, but the request was denied. Later, in 1907, Alfred suffered another stroke and passed away. He was buried in Littleton's historic cemetery as a military veteran, though there remains uncertainty about who covered the cost of his burial. Reports from the time suggest the government may have paid for it. According to newspapers, Alfred's final words about the case reiterated his innocence. In 1928, a monument was erected in Lake City at the site where Alfred's victims were buried, commemorating the tragic event. Nearly 70 years later, in 1998, James Stars, a law professor at George Washington University, led an investigation to shed new light on the case. He obtained permission to exhume the victims' remains to gather new information. The archaeological excavation conducted with students, experts, and journalists present unearthed the skeletons of the 5 victims in remarkably well-preserved condition. The remains were found side by side, with no bones mixed together, contradicting some of the accounts Alfred had provided. The skeletons were taken to the University of Arizona, where further forensic examinations were conducted. Initially, an anthropologist reported finding a hole that appeared to have been caused by a bullet. However, more detailed analysis revealed the hole had been created by wild animals gnawing on the bones, ruling out the possibility of a gunshot. The investigation concluded that 3 of the men were killed by blunt force trauma to the head. Additionally, the bones of their arms and hands showed cut marks, suggesting defensive wounds or damage inflicted during dismemberment, possibly to prepare the flesh for consumption. In his final statement, James Stars described Alfred Packer as a murderer, liar, and cannibal, expressing his belief that Alfred had murdered his companions and consumed their remains. Following the conclusion of the analysis, the skeletons were reburied, this time in a wooden box accompanied by a proper ceremony to honor the victims. In the years that followed, and even today, Alfred Packer's guilt or innocence remains a topic of intense debate. To some, he was a desperate cannibal who killed his companions amidst the extreme hunger of their ordeal. To others, the murders were premeditated, driven by greed and a desire to survive without regard for the lives of his victims. Hypotheses abound. Some speculate that Alfred posed as a guide with the intention of robbing and killing the man, exploiting their vulnerability in a hostile environment. Others argue he was simply a human being trying to survive against unsurmountable odds, trapped in extreme circumstances that led to horrifying decisions. Regardless of which version comes closest to the truth, the story of Alfred Packer remains one of the most enigmatic and grim accounts in American history, a case that continues to blur the line between survival and monstrosity.